Okay, we are live. Welcome everyone to QuaranCon 2020. We have a lovely not panel. We have a lovely reading coming up from Carol Park. And I just want to let everyone know, because this keeps coming up, that we've had a little technical issue where we can't overlap our Zoom meetings at all. And so basically, in order to get everybody up and in place on time, we're essentially running a few minutes late. Oh, and of course, this is now coming up and we're getting 20-second feedback. Okay, there we go. So anyway, so all of our panels will be starting about 3 to 5 minutes late, panels, readings, etc., as we get everybody on line appropriately after letting the last panel go to its last bit of time. So plan your schedules accordingly and give us that little bit of patience. We really appreciate it. Anyway, I just wanted to say that. And we have the lovely Carol Park here. She's just going to read for you. So I'm just going to get out of the way and let that happen.
Okay, so I think I'm good to go. Hi, I'm Carol A. Park, as Virginia just noted. If you know who I am at all, it's probably because you've read or heard of my Heretic Gods series, which I will not be reading from today. I'm actually going to be reading from a completely new, unrelated epic fantasy series that is not published yet, but the first of which will be coming out in June, hopefully. So I'm going to give you a first ever sneak peek of that. Because no one's ever seen it other than my editor and my beta readers. So congratulations. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start, and I'm going to read for you the prologue and possibly a little bit of chapter 1. We'll see how the time goes. So this is at the very beginning, prologue 16 years ago. Tyrfin stumbled forward. Though the nudge in his back had been gentle, his feet were reluctant to move along with his body. The distance from where he stood to the dais was only 10 yards. To Tyrfin, it might as well have been 10,000. A sunbeam from the eastern window fell across the polished floor in front of him, providing a hazy line to follow toward the dais. He focused on that line, ignoring the hundreds of eyes watching his agonizing progress across the sanctuary, ignoring the impatient rustling of the other children in line behind him, and most of all, ignoring the gaze of the god who waited for him at the top. He wasn't ready to look, not just yet. One step at a time, one foot in front of the other, he didn't need to look where he was going because he knew the front of the temple sanctuary and its contents as well as anyone in Ir Gadol. Since he and his father had moved to the city, his father had dragged him here at least every 12th day for 6 moons before Tyrfin had refused to go again. The glare of the sunbeam shattered when it reached the short stair to the top of the dais. 1, 2, 3 stairs, and then Tyrfin was staring at the feet of the Tsar. He swallowed hard. As amusing as it would be to throw up on a god, he was determined to keep the contents of his stomach where they belonged, for his father's sake. It was all for his father's sake. He just had to keep reminding himself of that. He pictured his father's face, haunted and weary, and let that image keep his feet planted where they were. Your mother would have been proud to see this day, his father had said that morning, and the words had broken his resolve. How could Tyrfin argue with that? He knew his father wanted more than anything else for life to seem normal again, and bringing your child to take the servant vow at age 12 was normal. It was something every child looked forward to from the day they understood it was coming. Tyrfin's persistent refusal to participate as the day approached had brought his father more pain than Tyrfin could finally bear. "What is your name, child?" said the Tsar. Tyrfin's stomach lurched again. The voice was rich and smooth, every word spoken with absolute precision. Even such a simple question rippled with authority. It was the sort of voice one was compelled to listen to and obey. "Child, Tyrfin, son of Hab," he said, the words ripped out of him against his will. He should have added "my lord," but he held the words back. A meaningless act of defiance, but what else was left to him? The Tsar said nothing about the missing token of respect. "And why have you come before me, Tyrfin, son of Hab?" Why, indeed? He raised his eyes to look at the Tsar and immediately regretted it. Though he appeared to be a man, Tyrfin knew better. He was tall, taller than anyone in the room, and his white robes were draped on his frame with graceful perfection. His features and complexion were flawless, and his steel gray eyes, They pierced straight through to Tirfan's soul. The Tsar's eyes weren't unkind. There was a touch of concern and also a question. Why did he hesitate? Tirfan's chest squeezed tight. Did he know? Could he see? His eyes began to burn, and at last he had to tear them away to stare back down at his feet. Be at peace, child, the Tsar said, his tone, though no less authoritative, a hint less intimidating than before. Why have you come before me? This time, Tirfan had to will the words out of his mouth on his own. In my 12th year, I come to take my servant vow and to enter the community as an individual responsible for the consequences of my own actions, though under the guardianship of my... He choked on the last word. It had almost come out as every other child had spoken it, how it should have come out. Parents. Of my father. The Tsar lifted his hand, and Tirfan sank to his knees beneath it. Who comes to release this child? There was a pause while Tirfan's father made his way to the front, but Tirfan closed his eyes. He didn't want to look at his father right now. In the name of the gods, for the honor of holy Urim, I, Ha'ab, son of Zakar, his father, release my son, his father said at last. The Tsar now addressed the crowd. Tirfan, son of Ha'ab, has come to take his servant vow. Who will serve as witness? In the name of the gods, for the honor of holy Urim, we will, the gathered crowd responded. And do you, Tirfan, son of Ha'ab, vow this day to be a loyal servant of holy Urim and his own divine servants, and to keep his code? The Tsar's voice sounded distant in Tirfan's ears. The pounding of his own heart was louder. Child, the Tsar said again. I... Say it, he tried again. Just say it. He glanced up at the Tsar. There was no anger or impatience in his face, merely expectance. And why not expect the vows? Why not expect the fealty that every citizen of the land swore? It meant so very little in the end, an agreement to abide by the laws of the land, to submit to the judgments of the chosen if he didn't. The bit about being a loyal servant, what did that even mean? But it was there. It was there, and Tirfan's mother had taught him not to make promises he couldn't keep or didn't mean. He shouldn't have thought of her. Tears pricked the back of his eyes. Tirfan, his father hissed from the side. There was an edge of desperation there. I can't, he said at last. A murmur swept the room, but Tirfan looked over at his father, whose broad shoulders had slumped. I'm sorry, father. The Tsar looked down at him, silent, only the slightest crease of his brow indicating that he was surprised. Tirfan's throat burned, and he struggled to keep his composure. He stood, ignoring the whispers in the room, and turned to go. Tirfan, son of Ha'ab. The word stopped him, and his stomach dropped. He turned around to face the Tsar. Why do you reject the vows? The Tsar was going to ask him here, now? Fine. Because I have no intention of ever being a loyal servant to the gods. You don't intend to keep the code? The Tsar asked with a slight arch of an eyebrow. For some reason, the question irritated him. He didn't want to debate the merits of the servant vow with the Tsar. He wanted to leave and forget this entire misguided attempt at restoring normalcy to a life that, no matter what his father wanted, would never be normal in the same way again. I have no problem with the law, Tirfan said, but I won't bow to you or your masters. A few audible gasps from the crowd met his words. But the Tsar merely regarded him for a moment longer, and then, after a slight lift of his shoulders, he said, Good enough. Good enough? Good enough? Tirfan could feel the tension in the room dissipate as the relieved crowd prepared to move on from this uncomfortable scene, but he wasn't ready to move on. He felt cheated, like his expressed desire not to take the vow had somehow been circumvented, or worse still, like he'd been tricked into taking it after all. My mother is dead. He didn't know where the words came from, other than his indignation at not being taken seriously. He spoke them so rarely, as if speaking them made them truer than the empty place at the table, or the silences where once there had been songs. The room fell quiet, and his father's head bowed to the ground. Tirfan angled himself away so he didn't have to see the impact of his words on his father. Now that the words had been spoken, he felt compelled to continue, to force the Tsar to understand. She's dead, and it's your fault, Rafah's fault, Urim's fault. Another wave of whispers, some not so quiet now, broke over the room. Questions that had soured in his stomach for 2 years rose like bile. And why, he demanded. How did my mother slip through the cracks? Were the gods too busy to be bothered? Sleeping, perhaps? What did we ever do to you? The horrified whispers turned into a low murmur. You promise peace. You promise life. You promise protection, but you're liars. Tyrfin felt as though he were about to explode. His chest heaved and the tears finally spilled over. There were scattered murmurs of blasphemy from the crowd, but the Tsar stood in calm silence. And then the Tsar's brow furrowed and surprise registered on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, hesitated, and then opened it again. Tyrfin had never seen the Tsar so indecisive, but he didn't have long to think on the strange occurrence. Tyrfin, son of Ha'ab, said the Tsar, you have been chosen. The words froze his tears, froze the hot flame in his chest, and he stared open-mouthed at the Tsar. What? The Lady Rafah has chosen you. As always, you have until your 16th year to decide whether you will accept. Impossible. That was absolutely impossible. I don't need 4 years to decide. Perhaps you didn't hear me when I said I don't want to serve the gods. The Tsar seemed almost relieved. Very well. And then he froze and looked to the side. Tyrfin followed his gaze, and the frozen flame sank into his stomach. She was here. Rafah, goddess of compassion, patron deity of the Rohemi race. One could describe a lesser deity like a Tsar, but to describe one of the 12? She was clothed in light, a light that he perceived with more than his eyes. It radiated from every part of her and seeped into every fissure of his being, as if to search out and banish the darkness inside. He couldn't help it. He fell to his knees, his face to the ground, along with everyone else in the room, including the Tsar. I greatly desire that you would reconsider, he heard from above him. Her voice was like the sun and rain. It spoke of care for every living thing that needed light and life. His tongue was stuck to the roof of his mouth, and he had to work it for a moment before he could manage a response. Is this my punishment? He whispered. She laughed, and it was beautiful. We do not punish mortals by choosing them, child, she said. Then with all due respect, my lady, Tyrfin said, I would rather drown myself in the river than become a priest. But that apparently wasn't good enough. She knelt in front of him and touched his chin to lift his head. He met her eyes, which were first the placid silver blue of a lake reflecting a fair sky, and then the tumultuous blue-green of the sea. It was difficult to hate such eyes, but that didn't stop him from trying. Light shines from darkness, she said. Wholeness rises from brokenness, and hope is found only in despair. So the healer who has been wounded has the greatest capacity for healing of all. He stared at her. I don't understand. She rose and the light diminished. Yaud-Eliram, she said, I know you're here somewhere. Please take young Tyrfin to Yaud Zakain's chambers. And before Tyrfin could protest, she caught him in her gaze once more. The look in her eyes stopped his breath. For a moment, he had the odd sensation that his heart beat in time with hers, and it ached. Her next words throbbed in those beats. You will. And then I'm going to read just a tad of chapter 1, which is 16 years later. There were few things that brought a priest more pleasure than accidentally passing a god in the temple hallway. That was why when Tyrfin saw the 2 priests who were walking ahead of him drop to their knees, he turned and started in the opposite direction. The voice of the Tsar came from behind him. Yaud Tyrfin. Tyrfin quickened his steps. Was it a paradox to pray for a god to leave him alone? Yaud, the Tsar said, suddenly at his side. So unfair. I've always wondered, Tyrfin said as he turned, if the Tsarim can instantaneously transport themselves from one end of the hallway to the other, why do you bother walking anywhere at all? The other 2 priests, now behind the Tsar, cast Tyrfin scandalized looks. He was used to scandalized looks from the other priests. The Tsar met his eyes and held them until Tyrfin was forced to look away, eyes burning. Completely unfair. Naturally, the Tsar didn't answer the question. You are leaving for Kisab tomorrow, the Tsar said. Tyrfin inclined his head. I am. Will you go on to Simak after? Tyrfin raised his eyebrow. Why did the Tsar care about his travel plans? That had not been my intent. You should consider it, the Tsar said. I think you would do well there. After all these years, you finally see your opportunity to get rid of me. Or perhaps I have reason to wish vengeance on my counterpart there. Tyrfin didn't know if a god could make jokes. The Tsar didn't smile. His voice was even. His face was placid. By all accounts, he was perfectly serious, and yet Tirfan opted for a short bow in response. The Tsar continued on, relieving the kneeling priests of their positions on the marble floor and allowing them to scurry on their way. A faint cheer floated down the hallway from the direction of the open sanctuary doors, reminding him of his promise to Zamara that he would watch a Sirigim match with her family at some point during the Rashab Bakates festival. He sighed. It was the final night of the festival, and thus the final night of the Sirigim tournament. Be their opportunities. Though he was sorely tempted to head home, he didn't want to break his promise. Besides, he'd never hear the end of it from Eliram if he didn't show. And that is the end of that. So I don't know if there are supposed to be questions or something. Hold on one second. And let me see if I can pull something up here. Sorry. Should have had this ready to go. There we go. Okay, so I have just one question, and that's when does the book come out? And that is, it should be out in June, at least that's my hope. I'm working on furiously trying to get it going right now as we speak. Well, not right at this very moment, but so it is a part of a series, yes. And it will be a 4-book series. It is an epic fantasy series, and let me just, which unlike my previous series, which was Sword and Sorcery, it's kind of a hopeful fantasy, sort of, I guess, a little different than before. And it's classic epic fantasy in the sense that it's about kind of big picture events rather than smaller picture events, but still very character driven. And for those who've read or heard of the Heretic Gods, still very focused on magic as well. There's another nuanced magic system because I love that. What I did with this series was I sort of turned the classic fantasy trope of the thing that happened, like, X number of years ago, like a millennia, 2 millennia, however long ago, on its head by, instead of writing the story thousands of years later, I'm actually writing about that story. So this is a very young Earth and a near perfect Earth and how it all goes wrong. So that's what this is about. And I have another question. Is there a romance? There is a romance. In fact, it's very much wrapped around a love story. So while it's not fantasy romance, I do like romance, and there is another one, much more sweet than perhaps you were used to in The Heretic Gods, if you've read it, but there is another love story that's very much a core of it. So I don't know if there's anything else to say about it. Hopefully I will have more information about that coming out very soon. And there are 3 viewpoint characters in the book, and that was one of them. Tirfan is one of them, main characters. So I hope you'll give it a chance. And when it comes out, if you haven't read Heretic Gods, that is currently available. The first book, Banebringer, is available now, as well as the second book, Cursebreaker, and a follow-up standalone book about one of the characters, Sweetblade. All of those are available now. The third book will be hopefully coming out sometime next year, 2021. So that'll finish up that series. I have another question. It is the one I just read from, which is the Chronicles of the Lady Tsar. The book one's called A World Broken, is a multiple point of view book. There's 3 characters, 3 point of view characters. And that I expect to remain the same throughout the entire series. I don't plan on adding any viewpoint characters at this point. So you can catch me on carolapark.com. On Twitter, I'm pretty active at ParkCarolA to find out more about this or my other series. And I think that's all I have to say, unless there's any other questions. think there's a slight delay in the YouTube between what I'm saying and that. So I think that's it. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for coming in and listening. I really enjoyed that reading. That was so good. And I just wanted to remind everyone that we have more readings coming up today. And hopefully lots more people will come watch this one after the fact. I've been tweeting about it. So thanks so much for being here, Carol. We really appreciate you taking time out to read for us. That was truly enjoyable.
Thank you.
And we're gonna say goodbye.
All right. Bye, everyone.